Hello everyone. The focus of this module today will be on reference letters. I'm hoping to provide both tips and also some real examples that will hopefully help you in understanding what reference letters look like and also to help you seek references for your own scholarship or grant applications. So in an academic setting, what do we use reference letters for? So we use, of course, if you're in a graduate program, you probably had to request letters of reference for your application to grad school, and then also later on for fellowship applications as well. These are also used, of course, in scholarship or award applications and also in job applications as well. My first biggest tip for reference letters is to consider who you choose for your reference letter. So at the MSc stage, ideally it's someone you've known for at least a year. And at the PhD stage, I would say ideally at least 2 years. But of course, if that's not possible, someone who you've known as long as possible. And then what are the sort of qualifications for the reference letter? I would say generally faculty, if it's for a scholarship application like CIHR or NSERC, I would say generally faculty members from a recognized institution. So this might be someone who supervised an honors thesis, supervised a directed studies. It might be a master's. If it's a PhD letter, it might be your master's supervisor. It might be a committee member. So someone who is on your master's or PhD committee. It might also be, I know many trainees who work as a research assistant in between grad school and their undergraduate degree. So and they might have served as a research assistant or in the research assistant capacity. It could also be a course instructor. It could also be a co-op supervisor. And it could also be a job or volunteer supervisor. The only caveat with these last pieces is they need to be able to speak to the criteria for the award or scholarship, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's, again, really critical to consider who you choose. First step is just to consider who to choose. Along the same lines of considering who you choose is to understand this general concept. I would say, as someone who's read thousands of reference letters, I would say 99% of the reference letters I read are excellent. So if the reference letter is kind of average, that's actually bad. And if it's below average, that can really sink an application. So this is in capitals for a reason, you really need to choose someone who can provide an excellent, outstanding reference. But how do you know your reference will be excellent? So the first point is that you have a good working relationship or over a sustained period of time with this referee. The second is that you've had no major disagreements or falling out with this referee. If you have previously received a job or an award using that same reference, of course, that would be an excellent reference to use. Also, someone who speaks highly of you to your peers and colleagues. And the last piece is really just ask. It is perfectly valid to ask a potential referee or reference if they can provide you an excellent letter of reference. You can actually just say, 1, would you be able to provide me a reference? And 2, can I count on that reference to be excellent or outstanding? In terms of actually practically asking your reference, so once you've decided who your reference might be, how do you actually ask a reference to serve as a reference? Sometimes there is an online system where you enter the referee's information and then it will send them an email. But even before you do that, you want to ask their permission to see if they would be willing to provide you a reference and an excellent reference. So the best way to start that process is with a simple email to say in kind of a formal way, "Dear Dr. So-and-so," and say, "I'm applying for this application." You can fill in the blank with the name of the application. Make it straightforward. "I was wondering if you could provide me with a letter of reference. and the reference is due, you can add the due date, and then you can give the main instructions for that reference. It's not always a 1 or 2 page reference letter. Sometimes I'll show you in a second in terms of finding out what exactly your reference needs to provide. But in this space, you can just kind of say some of the general formatting pieces. And then also, I recommend saying that you've attached a CV and included some bullet points of examples related to the selection criteria, and also attaching a copy of your application. And then, of course, actually doing that. So that means if you're attaching a copy of your actual application, that means you need to have a pretty rough draft of your application ready by the time you're seeking the references. And then you can sign here. So again, you're going to have to look at the specific instructions in terms of what the reference needs to provide. But this is just kind of a general template for just first seeking permission for someone to act as your reference. The next tip, and this is a really, really important tip for writing the reference letter. So as I mentioned before, it's important to provide examples for your reference. Even though you might have worked with someone for a long time, they won't necessarily remember especially in as much detail as you will, specific examples related to the selection criteria. So I highly recommend to provide a list of some detailed examples related to those criteria. And the second piece is to avoid vague or unsupported statements. Vague statements really just sink a reference letter. They need to be very detailed and very specific. So as an example, let's say the example you want to convey is about being a hard worker and showing enthusiasm for researcher. You could just say, okay, Peter was a very hard worker and showed enthusiasm for research. I see that type of language all the time, but much better is this next one, is Peter was such a hard worker that he responded to my emails while on vacation in Hawaii and showed such enthusiasm for research that he founded a journal club in our research center. Much, much better. You can see that detailed example provides a sort of vivid image of that specific criteria. As a second example, the first part is, okay, Peter showed creativity and originality while working in my group. Okay, again, I often see phrases like this, that stops here, and I'm left wondering, well, how is Peter creative and original? So a much better example is my lab was purchasing a commercially available device to assess nociceptive function. Peter showed incredible initiative and skill as he decided instead to build a custom one himself, saving our laboratory approximately $3,000. We have used Peter's custom device in dozens of experiments, and my colleagues have asked Peter to build one for them. This really exemplified creativity and originality. So now I've really brought life through this detailed example. I've really brought life to this idea of creativity and originality. And then as a third example, a statement like Peter won numerous awards and scholarships. Okay, that's fine. But look at how the second example brings much more life to this. When announcing Peter's poster prize, the MC jokingly said, Peter has won every MSc award at UBC. These detailed examples are much more compelling because they again bring life to those specific criteria. They're also just way more fun to read. As someone who reviews many, many reference letters, they start to really kind of blend together. So in order to stand out, you want to have these really detailed, concrete, specific examples. And again, you need to provide these to your referee they may remember some of them, but they will definitely not remember all of those examples related to the criteria. In terms of what kind of specific, I gave a few examples, but what specific examples should you provide in terms of which criteria? I've alluded to this before, but really just to kind of hammer home the point is to relate the examples to the criteria. So on the NSERC website, and this relates to the Master's Awards for NSERC and also for the Master's Awards for CIHR. So the CIHR and NSERC CGSM. And really, the doctoral ones are actually very similar. Just the weight for those criteria shifts a bit. But in general, you can see the examples related to academic excellence, research potential, and then also personal characteristics and interpersonal skills. And within these, you can see some keywords like project management, volunteering, community outreach. And then you can also see up here keywords like initiative and autonomy. So really, again, relate your examples to the selection criteria. And this is sort of taking lots of kind of across many different scholarships and putting these kind of together into some specific keywords. So the first kind of piece of the reference letter I kind of recommend is what one of my colleagues calls the list of awesome. So these are things that if you have any of these, they should absolutely be mentioned right away, right up top in your reference letter. And of course, when you're seeking a reference, you should definitely remind your referee about this kind of list of awesome. So awards, presentations, a GPA. If your GPA is not very high, that's okay. You might just mention some excellent grades in one or two specific classes. And then also publications and the impact of some of those publications. So if you, especially as a trainee at the master's or PhD level, if you have publications or presentations as well, that should definitely go in your list of awesome. It should definitely go into your reference letter. I also recommend including extracurricular activities, even if these were not directly supervised by your reference. And what I mean by that is, so for example, I provide many reference letters to my trainees, but I only supervise them in terms of their research project. I don't supervise their extracurricular activities, but it's still perfectly valid for me to comment on some of those extracurricular activities. And then also to comment on skills, and then lastly, the quality of the proposed work. So a bit of a narrative of why the thesis work is important. And then in terms of some of the traits, I mentioned a couple of these traits like initiative and autonomy. These are kind of other traits that you don't have to touch upon all of these, but I would at least recommend thinking about all of these, and then also for sure including some of these. So traits like being reliable, being dedicated, having autonomy or independence, that's a pretty big one, especially at the PhD level. Initiative, persistence, time management skills, communication skills, integrity, collaboration skills, and then also critical thinking skills. So what you need to do then is to what I tend to do is kind of make a list of all of these traits and some of this list of awesome, and then provide those detailed or concrete examples to your potential reference. The next tip is to look at the references interface. So go into the system. Most systems, such as CIHR and NSERC, and most major awards and scholarships allow you to actually see exactly what the referee needs to do. So do they need to upload a PDF document of a signed letter? Do they need to fill in specific boxes? And if so, what are the instructions for those boxes? So the tip here is find out exactly what your reference has to provide, and then also make your list or whatever materials you provide conducive to that format. The next tip is to write your own reference letter as an exercise. So I mentioned at minimum providing your referee with your sort of bullet points addressing the major criteria, but also try writing your own reference letter into a full narrative. Pretend you are writing from the point of view of your supervisor, and write the reference letter from the point of view of them. This can be a difficult exercise. It's hard to sort of brag about yourself, but it's really, really important. It's a really, really important skill. As you'll see, sometimes your reference might ask you to draft a few sections of the entire reference letter, and they will, they'll still provide critical feedback and they'll make important changes to it. But many will ask you to sort of help begin the process for them. So try this as an exercise and have one. Always have sort of a go-to kind of template reference letter that I can then use when I'm asking for a reference. But you really do need to kind of get past having problems bragging about yourself. You really need to be able to make sure that your reference letter conveys an outstanding trainee, that it conveys excellence. It's also good to note that, when your supervisor is impressed by something in the future, jot those down. Those specific examples are sometimes hard to think of when you on the spot, but if you kind of keep a note of, okay, my supervisor said I did an excellent job this lab meeting and really appreciated that I organized the laboratory freezers without being asked, something like that, keep those notes, and then it's really easy to put together these types of documents. The last tip is this, that your reference letter should be glowing. I mentioned it'd be excellent or outstanding, but it shouldn't be over the top. And I do see this fairly often, and this was from Twitter, or X, I suppose now. And this is just kind of a joke between comparing the American style versus the British style. And this one always kind of makes me laugh. It starts off saying, the American style, I've never recommended anyone more highly than this. Jones is without a doubt the most agile thinker of his generation, perhaps any generation living memory. I would like to say he will revolutionize this field, but such an understatement would do no justice to his true abilities. More likely, he will define an entirely new field, Jones studies, that will enjoy such prestige that a Nobel Prize in Jones studies will soon be created, with Jones as the inaugural recipient. Indeed, I would not be surprised to see Jones win 3 or 4 Nobel Prizes, given his strong side interest in medicine, physics, and peace. So obviously a bit of satire, but it definitely raises the point of it should be glowing, but you need to kind of find the balance between glowing and over the top. So those are my major tips for reference letters. I now want to go through I note this is fictional, a fictional example of a reference letter. So the first piece is, of course, a date. So that they're on institutional, not overhead, letterhead. They have a date, and then dear so-and-so. So the first paragraph is really just the recommendation, right? So I'm delighted to give, and it should say something like this: highest recommendation. I should know right away, I know this is a glowing reference. And that should be, I think, in the first sentence. The next part is really just usually how you know how the reference knows the trainee. And then the next paragraph is your list of awesome, right? So these are really critical points that, again, relate to the selection criteria and are really kind of major things. So in this example, a science scholar, kind of a major scholarship award. And it kind of provides a few more details on the prestige of the award, and then other in terms of a poster prize and also a 3-minute thesis competition, right? So the first paragraph, again, starts off with, I'm nominating Jack, and Jack is awesome. I know that right away. This is how I know Jack. And this is Jack's list of awesome. The next paragraph, and this is really, the next few paragraphs really, again, are still addressing the selection criteria. So I've put in red, I've put some specific selection criteria, like written communication skills, initiative, sort of above and beyond, dedication, independence, and time management skills. And then in the underlined portions, I provide what I would consider a fairly detailed and concrete example related to that specific value or trait. And again, you really want to, I won't read through this. I'll leave it to you to read through this on your own time. But again, think about how one which skills or traits are noted here in red, and then also look at the detailed example underlined related to that piece and think of your own examples. And it goes on for the next slide too, in terms of being other traits such as detail-oriented, critical thinking, collaboration and teamwork, persistence and resilience, which sort of relate to troubleshooting. And then again, underline these detailed examples. So again, please read through this to make sure you have some ideas for what type of examples might relate to these criteria, and again, which criteria are here. The last few paragraphs, I'd say comment on the importance of the project. And then lastly, or I guess second last would be what I mentioned before, how it's perfectly valid for your supervisor or your reference to comment on things that were outside of their supervision. So for example, volunteering activities or mentoring activities. And the reason I include these here is because if you look back to the selection criteria, you can see leadership and community service are in the selection criteria. So if your reference is a reference letter format, it's nice to address all the criteria in one. And then the last is just a closing statement. Again, you started off with saying this, I will provide a glowing reference, and end in saying this is a glowing reference. So that concludes this session on tips and real examples related to reference letters. If you have any requests for other types of videos you'd like to see, please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.